Hey there guys, and welcome back. We are here showcasing the HP indicator update in the Mythic Table Extension. So first off, as always, got to come up here to the top right and activate the Mythic Table Extension add-on. As you can see, initiative gets populated and everything else is set up. And what this extension does is it allows for a few tags. So the first tag that we have is max HP and current HP on tokens. So you can see that this is the format we use for tokens specifically. So let's say I change this to 5 right here, current HP, hit save, and as you can see, this is now a yellowish green. And if I change this again to 1, it is now red. And as you might expect, if I change this to 0, we actually get the skull icon, which is pretty cool. So this automatically updates a token's color ring. This is the border color, and it will also add and remove this skull icon depending on whether or not the character is dead or not. So that is player side, that's facing player side. The players can update their own tokens. But what if you are the GM? Let's say if you're the GM and you don't want your players seeing how much HP your enemy, NPCs, monsters, etc. have, then we need a solution for that, and that is over here in the GM character. Now originally I did say that this should be something that players never touch, nobody ever touches. This was supposed to be all background, but at this point this is the only place I have to put it, so it ended up over here anyway. And that is the final tag that we've implemented here, which is the HP tracker tag. And this tag is special because it is lit, so we have these curly brackets right here on either side, and then we have a list of token names. And the token names are current HP, max HP, that's how that is formatted. So if we change a couple of these, so let's do that, and that, and if I save, as you can see, this guy turned red and this guy turned yellow, and likewise, as you will expect, that guy is now dead. So that way you can manage the NPC's HP over here inside of this tag without the players being able to see it. However, the players will be able to see how damaged the enemy characters are, which makes sense, right? Oftentimes your players will ask, how beat up is that guy, when they're trying to decide who exactly they want to fight. So now you don't have to actually go out of your way to tell them. Now they can just look at the enemy tokens and say, oh, okay, that guy is clearly more wounded than the other guys, and that makes everybody's life easier. I released the HP indicator update really late Friday night, and by Saturday I actually had a patch for it. You can read through the patch notes if you like, but suffice it to say that there were a couple of minor edge cases that I hadn't considered when doing the update, and after playing with it I decided, oh, okay, you know what, these should be updated to make everybody's life easier and to fix a couple obvious problems. And you can get the CRX as always right down here. If you have trouble installing it, then make sure to look at the FAQ and troubleshooting on the README. Otherwise, this is the current official release. I have since come up with a couple more changes. Those are only available on the GitHub right now. So if you want to clone the repository, those are live here. That is the most recent patch 2 right here. I did not do an official release for this because about 90% of it is just background code that you'll never see. The one feature that I added that you may be interested in is up inside the pop-up window. You can see we now have the clear current combat. Also, this is slightly different format, but again, that's a very minor thing. But the clear current combat button here inside of the pop-up will allow you to remove the current combat tag from all tokens. So that makes your life a lot easier if, for example, you do a combat on one map and then head to a different map, and now you got to go back and remove all those current combats. Or, for example, if you have not deleted all the tokens from the previous combat and you want to just remove them from the initiative list, that will do that. That will get rid of all the current combat tags on all tokens. Now, before we conclude the patch overview and move over to the developer section where we talk about the code itself for those people who are interested, I would like to throw out for the general public, having used the extension and Mythic Table since implementing these changes, there are a couple more things that I think I'm going to implement, and I'm throwing them out there just because I want to see what other people's take is on them. And basically what it comes down to is this whole entire problem that our tokens show up on other maps and they are not linked together. They are not linked back to characters, and they can be duplicates. That's the biggest problem. Now there's a couple ways that can fix that on the back end. For example, we could set up a sync list so that for any given character, so let's grab Gandalf the Goon here, I could mark this as synced, let's say, and we could have the backend search whenever there is an update to this character for all tokens on all maps and ensure that all those tokens get all the updates off of this character. So whenever I make a change to the description, to the name, to the token setup, here, it would always populate to all maps at the same time. That would be useful. That is one way of solving it. The other way of solving it would be to set up either a callback or a button that whenever we take a character and drop it in here, and again, it's going to depend on a couple things. I'd have to really consider how exactly you want to set up, but we may want to, the other way to do it is to just delete all tokens with a matching name. So when we drop Gandalf the Goon on another map, it would come back to this map right here and delete this token. Or if I had a whole bunch of maps with a whole bunch of Gandalf the Goons on them, we could add something up here in the pop-up, a keep only this character button or something to that effect, which would then check for which token is on the current map, find the token that matches the current map, keep that one and delete all other copies of that token. So that would be the other option, the other way of solving that problem. Again, this is just an idea. I don't know how big of a deal it is for everybody. It has caused problems for us in the back end that we had to work around. The fact that the characters are not linked to tokens and that multiple tokens of the same name can exist across multiple maps. So it really comes down to whether or not that is actually a serious enough problem and whether or not enough people really think that you should only have, for any given character, one token of the same name at a time. So yeah, again, I'm just throwing that out there to see whether or not that's something people actually want, or if I'm just overcomplicating things. Feel free to leave a comment on the video with your personal opinion, your personal experience having played with Mythic Table, etc., on whether or not that actually is something we should look into changing. And that concludes the update overview. We are now going to dive into the code in the back end for developers, for GMs and players, and end users who just want to see what the new update included. You can feel free to leave now. Otherwise, for anybody else wants to see what exactly went on in the background to make this work and a couple of changes to the application itself, we will go over that now. So as you can see, we have this new plugin right here, the HP indicator plugin. It's set up just like all the other plugins. We've got a series of regexes as always to parse out the description. And first thing you may notice is that we have this new collection patch filter callback. This is a newly implemented feature in the app in the MTE, the Mythic Table Extension class proper. And basically, as you can see, if we come down here and look at the description, this is specifically for filtering out collections patch. So basically what it comes down to is the collections patch is a catch-all for all the different collections, but sometimes you only want tokens, sometimes you only want characters, etc, etc, etc. So this gives you the option to filter out all the other stuff before you get to your actual callback. So you can pass in the callback that you want to call eventually, and then we have this options object which has a series of different options. So if we come back over here to HP indicator, you can see how that works. So in this case, we want to only get tokens, and we only want the patch to include the description. So if the icon changes, if the token's image change, we're going to ignore those. We're only going to look for description changes. So rather than having to include that check inside of our callback here, which is actually up here, sorry, token callback, instead of having to check for all this stuff in the token callback, we have this nifty little check, this filter function in between, and we will never have this called for anything that is not a token and not a description. Down here you can see we can also filter by ID, and this actually also takes all these can also take functions. Okay, so if you need to dynamically determine what it is, for example in this case the GM character, we don't know what the GM character's ID is going to be, so instead we pass in a function. It will call that function to generate what we need. As you can see, any function that you pass into any of these filters should return a list, an array. It should return an array, which is why this function we have right here returns the ID as part of an array. So that is point number 2, and yeah, I think there's actually nothing else that we really need to go over for this new function. This is the last thing I'll say. If we need additional filtering capabilities, then we can always add those later, you know? We can just add additional options as we need them. Otherwise, the collection, the ID, and the path, so whether it's a description update, a icon update, etc, 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 I think these are basically the only filters you'll need 99% of the time. But if something else comes up and it does become necessary, we can always extend this function to include other checks. Moving on through the setup here, the next thing I will note is this line right here. As you can see, the HP indicator does not run for anyone who's not the GM. And the reason for this is to prevent us from accidentally updating the color on the token rings multiple times. So if every single player who was using the MTE extension, or I guess Mythic Table Extension, otherwise MTE extension would be Mythic Table Extension, which is rather redundant, but point being is if everybody's using it, then everybody would be updating the ring color multiple times. So we don't want that. We're only doing it with the GM. Down here in set color, I technically came back and fixed that. This is an undocumented fix, but as you can see right here, if border color equals color, then return. So technically speaking, this would not be so much a problem, but you would have to get through all the other code getting up to this point. So that would be running a bit of code, and it would be fetching extra tokens. So it still makes sense not to have this run on anybody other than GM, because it does save cycle time and fetches. So that is how that works. Right here we have an initial setup. Makes sense, right? Make sure that when the extension is first loaded, all the rings are in sync. And then as you can see, we have our parsing functions. So the parse token obviously just goes through and looks for max and current. And then it goes ahead and puts those into an object that we can check later. The GM. So because the GM handles multiple characters, this is actually going to return, as you can see, an array of such objects. And that's also going to include the token, because we need a reference to the token in order to update its ring color. So for that reason, the the parse GM function will return an array. It always returns an array even if it doesn't have any, just to make our life easier. That way you can always iterate over the result instead of checking what the result is first. So for that reason, we've got this array, and again it has max HP, current HP, and then the token. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. The other thing to note is that this was part of patch 2, which I mentioned before patch 1. Patch 2 is not on the release. Part of patch 1 was that for the GM token, we can match multiple tokens with this name. So for each of those tokens, we add that token to the list. So for example, if you say my NPC Jim, okay, is traveling with the party. And so NPC Jim is on map number 1. He's on map number 2, he's on map number 3, but I always manage his HP from the GM character, right, on the sidebar. Well, if I always manage his HP from the sidebar, that means I'm never on the token itself, which means that we never get an update for the token itself, and therefore we never know what token to update. We can only assume it's the very first one, but that's only the token on map 1, right? Not the token on map 2 or 3. So for that reason, it gets all the tokens named. As you can see right here, get tokens by name. So it gets all the tokens named NPC gym. And for each one of those, puts it on the list so that we can update Jim's token on all maps at the same time. Here's the token callback. So this is what's called every single time that we have an update. Gets the token, parses the token, sets the ring cover. Easy. GM callback. Gets the GM character, parses the GM character. For each token and result, again, this is why we return a list no matter what, because now we don't have to check what this result is. This will just be an empty list, and we can iterate over an empty list. So, if the token result does not have a token on it, we continue. This should never actually happen, but it's here just in case. There is no case in which the parse GM pushes to the result an object that does not have a token, but one of those things, just a catch in case. And set ring color, easy peasy. Now, this is part of patch 1. These are 2 more things for patch 1. And it looks like I forgot to clear the logs out here, but regardless, ignore that. Those will get fixed in the future. It's not that big of a deal, just logging the console. The name change. So if you have a token, let's say, and this is again documented in the patch notes, patch number 1 notes. Now, in theory, if it is a token update, like if the token itself is updated, then there is a chance that the token already has max HP, current HP on it. So this may not have a result, or this may have a result, it may not have a result. Otherwise, we parse the GM because chances are what happened is it was an NPC, for example, a goblin, and we renamed it to goblin number 1, which is the example I give in the patch notes. And now we got to check the GM for goblin number 1's HP. So that's how this works. And as always, this is pretty straightforward. It works like the other ones. And for the token add, same kind of idea, right? So I had a character, let's say, and I add the character to the map. That creates a token, but the token's description hasn't changed, right? It's only created the token. However, on my character, I had the at maximum HP and at current HP tags on there. So those will not, again, trigger just like before because it's not a description update. So this catches that and just runs the code as necessary. And finally, for the set ring color, which is the function we've been calling in all these other guys, pretty simple, straightforward. So we first do some bodging on the HP here. We make sure that the HP is reasonable. So as you can see here, if max HP is less than current HP, that shouldn't happen, but if it's misconfigured, then we just max it out. You know, we just set the both to be equal. This will not update on the back end. This is only for the front end coloring, so your token will not have its values changed. You don't have to worry about that. If the current HP is less than 0, we just set it at 0 because that makes the math easier. If max HP is greater than 0, then we go ahead and do the math. We just get the percentage of what the current HP is compared to the max HP. So if we are 5 out of 10, that's 50%, right? 0.5. Otherwise, if max HP is 0, then the percentage is just 0. So if we had 1 current HP and 0 max HP, if we tried to run this, that would be 1 divided by 0, which would be a problem. So we avoid that by having this if statement right here. Next, we get the color, and basically we just take a percentage of red and green off of 25. This is inverted right here because we want the red to be the 0 amount. So when 0, we want the maximum of 255. And when at 100%, we want 0, so 1 minus 1 would be 0 times 255. Likewise, just in reverse over on this side for green. And that way we get between red and green. We get a color spectrum between the two. Now, I will say that in theory, we could make this more complicated. So, for example, when you were looking at the demo earlier, we had a greenish yellow as the 50% color, right? And that's only because we're taking these values exactly like this. We're doing this linearly. That may not be as good looking as having a separate special gradient to iterate through. That would require more effort, and I'm not entirely sure. It would require some amount of research on my part how exactly to set up a gradient, a custom gradient, that makes a more pronounced shift in colors. So for example, we'd have to go from we would expect it, I should say, to go from green to a bright yellow, and then from a bright yellow to red, right? So we'd have to get that all mixed up, and I suspect we'd probably have to add a little bit of blue in there too, which again makes things a little bit complicated. So I decided to keep it simple for right now. We can consider updating this in the future. Create hex string just converts this RGB value to a hex value. And then, as I mentioned before, we check the border color and check if it's already the same color. If it is, we don't bother updating the token. Otherwise, we update the token and we add the death icon if we need to. And if the character is no longer dead and has the death icon, you know, for example, got healed, then we can take that off automatically. And finally, this is a little bit of an important one. The coin and tile are the only two border styles that include border color. The other two, which are circle and square, do not show the border color. It removes those. So that would cause this HP indicator to not work. You wouldn't be able to see the color. So we need to force that border color, that border mode, that border style to be one of these two, coin by default, if we want to show that border color. If we don't want to show that border color, then you honestly should not be using the tags and it shouldn't be on your HP tracker. So that's kind of on you. If you wanted to have a square or circle instead of a coin or tile border style, then you really shouldn't have put the tags on there to begin with, because the tags do not work if you want one of those two styles. And finally, we do the token update. And that was the whole entire HP indicator plugin, everything inside of that. That's how that works. In case you want to update it, you know how it works now. And finally, again, this is an unofficial update. This is patch 2, which was not officially released, but I did come back in here and rearrange this. As you can see, we now have this async await right here to set up the plugins. So previously we had a bunch of then statements down here to set up each plugin explicitly. Now instead we iterate over the whole entire plugins object and do them automatically. That does mean that we can change this up here. I did mention this in the first video that we may be changing this. So now instead of just having pop-up buttons here, which would just automatically set up the buttons to attach to their correct callbacks, instead of doing that, we provide setup functions, and inside of those setup functions, you can do whatever you need to do to get it set up. So for example here, as you can see, we had actually down here, let me start with copy character. All this code, right, or all this HTML, I should say, used to be on the pop-up. As you can see, the pop-up is now empty. I am going to let the pop-ups themselves generate their own HTML and handle all that stuff themselves. So here in setup character, we populate the pop-up with the HTML we want. And as you can see, we also have these callbacks, which we had before. But in addition to that, we now add the on click for the paste character, and the paste character button is only on click, set up for on click when we actually have a character on the clipboard. And then same thing up here for the new clear current combat button. We populate the pop-up with our initiative plugin, and then we set up the button to be attached to clear current combat. And clear current combat just offloads to initiative clear current combat, the plugin itself that is run on the page. And if we scroll down here to the bottom, as you can see, that just iterates through all of the tokens, checks them for a current combat, and then replaces that current combat with a blank and updates the token. And that concludes our review of all the code for the developers out there who are interested. So thank you guys for hanging out, and feel free to leave your feedback in the comments, and I will see you in the next update.